There are certain moments you replay in your mind, trying to pinpoint the exact second everything changed. The moment when the line between what was right and what felt unavoidable blurred, and you crossed it without realizing it. That morning was one of those moments. The house was eerily quiet. Make sure to subscribe to my channel so I can continue bringing you more fascinating true stories like this one. And don't forget to watch this video till the end and like the video, because this story is going to be incredibly interesting. Please hit the like button to show your support. Thomas had left early, as he always did, and his absence lingered like an unspoken accusation. Sunlight filtered through the bedroom window, catching the dust motes floating lazily in the still air. I sat at the edge of the bed, hands resting loosely in my lap, staring at nothing in particular. Then the door opened. At first I barely noticed, thinking it was Thomas returning for something he had forgotten. But when I looked up, it was Ethan, standing in the doorway, his silhouette filling the frame. He looked surprised, maybe a little guilty, but he didn't leave. I said nothing either. Looking back, I realized that was the moment. A moment so small, so quiet, it seemed insignificant, yet it became the spark that ignited everything. I could tell you everything began with Ethan walking in when I didn't expect it, but the truth is, it started much earlier. It began with the empty spaces Thomas no longer filled, with the growing silence over the years, and with an ache I had nearly convinced myself didn't exist. What happened between Ethan and me wasn't planned. It wasn't something I could have foreseen in my loneliest moments. But once it began, every choice I made only drew me deeper, unraveling the life I thought I had. Now, as I try to piece everything together, I wonder if I could return to that moment. Would I have shut the door, or was it always meant to stay open? The days after that should have blended into the routine of everyday life, but they didn't. Every look, every word, every moment spent with Ethan was filled with an intensity I couldn't explain. It started innocently, a conversation here, a shared cup of coffee there. He was witty, quick in a way that surprised me. His presence filled the house in ways Thomas no longer did. One evening, while Thomas worked late, Ethan lingered in the kitchen after dinner. "Do you ever feel stuck?" he asked, leaning against the counter, a glass of water in his hand. I glanced up from the plate I was rinsing. "Stuck? How?" He shrugged, his gaze distant. "Like you're just going through the motions, waiting for something to wake you up." The words hit harder than I cared to admit. I dried my hands, leaning against the sink. "Everyone feels that way at some point," I said cautiously, "but waiting for change doesn't always work. Sometimes you have to make it yourself." He laughed, a low, sardonic sound. Easier said than done. His eyes met mine, and for a moment the silence between us said more than words could. It felt fragile, even dangerous. A week later, Thomas announced that he'd be gone for a business trip, a conference in Denver for 4 days. "Are you sure you'll be okay here?" he asked over breakfast, not looking up from his phone. I smiled tightly. "I've been alone before, Thomas. I can manage." Ethan glanced up from his plate, his expression unreadable. When Thomas left, the house felt vast. Every creak and groan of the house was magnified in the quiet. I retreated to my bedroom early, trying to focus on a book, but I couldn't concentrate. My thoughts were scattered, a restlessness weighing on my chest. At 10 p.m., I heard the faint sound of the television downstairs. Curious, I padded down the hallway and found Ethan on the couch, flipping through channels. "Still up?" I asked softly. He glanced back, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Can't sleep. You?" We exchanged a look before he shifted, patting the spot beside him. "Want to join me? I promise no bad reality TV." I hesitated but sat down. The cushions dipped slightly under my weight, and the space between us felt too small. We settled on an old black and white film, the kind Thomas would have rolled his eyes at. Midway through, a soft laugh escaped me at a cheesy line of dialogue, and Ethan turned, his expression soft. "You have a great laugh," he said, almost shyly. I blinked, caught off guard. "I just mean, I don't hear it often. You should laugh more." His sincerity disarmed me. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. Instead, I felt his hand brush against mine. Just a brief touch, but it sent a shock through me. "I should go to bed," I said abruptly, standing too quickly. "Ethan," he said softly, his voice pulling me back. I paused, looking at him, and for a moment I thought he might say something that would change everything. But he didn't. He only nodded, his gaze lingering on mine. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything. My hands trembled as I folded laundry, my thoughts replaying that moment on the couch. I told myself it meant nothing, that I was overthinking it. But later that evening, as I walked past Ethan in the hallway, his fingers brushed mine, too deliberate to be accidental. My skin burned where he touched me. It felt like we were caught in a game neither of us had agreed to play but couldn't stop. Every interaction felt like a move, every glance a silent question. On the third night of Thomas's absence, everything changed. I had gone to bed early, hoping to avoid another moment with Ethan, but as I sat there in the dim light of my bedside lamp, a soft knock startled me. "Ethan?" I called hesitantly. The door opened and he stepped inside, his face unreadable. "Sorry," he said quickly, I needed to talk to someone." I gestured for him to sit. My heart pounded as he perched on the edge of the bed. For a moment he said nothing, but then in a rush he said, "I don't know what I'm doing, Ava, with everything, school, my dad. I just feel so lost." His vulnerability was like a sharp knife twisting in my chest. Without thinking, I reached out, resting my hand lightly on his arm. "You're not lost, Ethan. You just haven't found your way yet." His gaze met mine, and the air between us shifted. "You really think that?" he asked. "I do," I whispered. And then, before I could process what was happening, he leaned in. It was tentative at first, a question more than a statement. I could have pulled away. I should have, but I didn't. Hours later, I lay awake, the soft moonlight bathing the room. Guilt gnawed at me, but there was something else, too, relief. For the first time in years, I felt seen. The next morning, sunlight streamed into the bedroom, but it did nothing to chase away the chill that had settled in my chest. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My hair was disheveled, my face pale. Downstairs, I could hear Ethan moving around in the kitchen. I told myself I had to face him, address what had happened, and make sure it never happened again. But as I descended the stairs, each step heavier than the last, my resolve began to falter. Ethan looked up from where he stood at the counter, a mug of coffee in hand. He didn't speak, and the silence stretched until it became unbearable. "We need to talk," I said finally, my voice more steady than I felt. "Do we?" His voice was soft, almost disarming. "What happened? I think it was mutual," I said, swallowing hard as my hands gripped the back of a chair. "Mutual or not, it was wrong," I added. For a moment I thought he might argue, but then he nodded, his gaze falling to the floor. "I know," he said quietly. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting because even as we agreed to move past it, the memory of his touch lingered, and I couldn't ignore the pull I felt toward him. When Thomas returned that evening, his briefcase in one hand and a distracted smile on his face, I forced myself to ask, "How was the conference?" "Productive," he replied, already scrolling through his emails on his phone. Across the room, Ethan watched silently, his expression unreadable. The days began to blur into a dangerous rhythm. In public, we were careful, polite, distant. But when Thomas wasn't around, the stolen moments became harder to resist. A brush of fingers in the hallway, lingering too close in the kitchen, and then one evening, in the dim light of the garage, Ethan kissed me again. This time, I didn't pull away. "You've been different lately," Sophia said, her voice light but her eyes sharp. Sophia had always been the kind of friend who noticed things others didn't. We sat at a cafe downtown, the smell of roasted coffee beans thick in the air. "Different? How?" I asked, trying to feign ignorance. She tilted her head, studying me. "Distracted. Happier, maybe, but also distant." "Is everything okay with Thomas?" Everything's fine, I said, too quickly, taking a sip of my latte. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment, and I thought she might press further, but then she leaned back, shrugging. If you say so, she said. Just don't keep me in the dark, okay? I forced a smile, nodding, but as I drove home later, her words echoed in my mind. How much had I given away without realizing it? The following week, Thomas announced he'd be working late again, leaving the house quiet. By mid-evening, Ethan and I were sitting in the living room, the TV playing some forgettable sitcom in the background. We shouldn't keep doing this, I said abruptly, breaking the silence. Ethan turned to me, his expression calm but intense. Do you really believe that? He asked. I opened my mouth to respond, but the sound of the garage door opening interrupted me. Thomas is home, I hissed, leaping to my feet as panic gripped me. Ethan moved quickly, his movements smooth and practiced, grabbing his glass and slipping into the kitchen. By the time Thomas walked in, loosening his tie, everything appeared normal. Me on the couch with a book, Ethan rinsing dishes at the sink. Long day? I asked, my voice steady. Same, he replied, sitting next to me on the couch. My heart raced in my chest, but I forced a smile, leaning over to kiss his cheek. As the weeks passed, the pressure began to grow. Sophia's questions became more pointed, and Ethan's friends began showing up unexpectedly, keeping us on edge. One evening, Thomas asked me to join him at a work event, a dinner with his colleagues at an upscale restaurant downtown. Do I have to go? I asked, feigning a headache. It would mean a lot to me. People are starting to ask why you're never around, he said. Reluctantly, I agreed. But as I sat through hours of polite conversation and forced laughter, I couldn't shake the guilt gnawing at me. When we returned home, Thomas leaned in to kiss me goodnight, but I turned my head slightly, his lips brushing my cheek instead. He pulled back, his expression unreadable. Is something wrong? He asked quietly. No, I lied, forcing a smile. Just tired. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I knew the distance between us was growing, and I couldn't tell if I felt more relieved or ashamed. The turning point came one Saturday afternoon. Thomas was out running errands, and Ethan and I were in the backyard pretending to garden, but really just enjoying the privacy. You're getting sunburned, I teased, reaching over to adjust the brim of his hat. Ethan grinned, his hand brushing mine. Maybe you just like an excuse to fuss over me. I laughed, swatting his arm, but then the sound of a car pulling into the driveway froze us both. Go inside, I whispered urgently. Ethan hesitated for a split second before nodding and slipping through the side door. By the time Thomas walked into the backyard, I was kneeling by the flower bed, my hands covered in dirt. What are you doing out here? He asked, his tone light but curious. Just weeding, I replied, forcing a casual smile. He didn't seem suspicious, but the close call left my nerves frayed. The situation became even more precarious when Ethan's old college roommate, Jake, showed up unexpectedly one evening. Jake! Ethan exclaimed, genuinely surprised. What are you doing here? Thought I'd swing by, see how you're doing, Jake replied, clapping Ethan on the back. He glanced at me. You must be Ethan's stepmom. Heard a lot about you. Good things, I hope, I said smoothly, shaking his hand. Jake laughed, but his eyes lingered a beat too long, making me uneasy. Over the next few days, Jake's presence created a constant tension. He was charming and easygoing, but there was something calculating in the way he observed Ethan and me, as if sensing the undercurrent we were desperately trying to hide. One night, after Jake had gone to bed, Ethan and I sat on the porch in silence. He knows, Ethan said suddenly, his voice low. I turned to him, startled. What do you mean? Jake, he said. He's not stupid. He's pieced it together. Panic clawed at my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. You're imagining things. He doesn't know anything. Ethan didn't respond, his jaw tight. As the night went on, the weight of his words settled over me like a heavy shroud. With Jake's suspicions looming and the web of lies growing, the affair teetered on the edge of exposure. 2 days later, the first crack appeared. It was subtle, but in retrospect, devastating. I was in the kitchen preparing lunch when Jake strolled in casually, leaning against the counter. You've got a lovely house, he said. his tone light but his eyes sharp. It's got that warm, lived-in vibe. "Thank you," I replied, keeping my focus on chopping vegetables. "Must be nice having Ethan around again," he said. "I bet Thomas appreciates having someone else to look after things." There was a subtle edge to his words, and I froze for a moment before forcing a smile. "Ethan's been a big help. It's nice having the company," I said. Jake chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You two seem pretty close." The knife in my hand slipped slightly, nicking my finger. I hissed in pain, reaching for a paper towel as Jake stepped closer. "Careful," he said, his voice low. "Wouldn't want anyone to get hurt." His meaning was clear. And as he left the kitchen, I pressed the towel harder against my finger, my mind racing. That evening, Sophia stopped by unannounced, bringing a bottle of wine. Her smile was warm, but her eyes were scrutinizing. "Thought you might want some company," she said, setting the bottle on the counter. I poured a glass, my hands trembling slightly. "So," Sophia began after a sip, "how's everything?" "Fine," I replied quickly, too quickly. She leaned back, swirling her wine. "You know, Ava, I've known you a long time, and I've never seen you this distracted." "Work has been stressful," I lied, avoiding her gaze. Her eyes narrowed. "Is it work or is it something else?" I stiffened, but before I could respond, Thomas walked in. "Sophia, nice to see you." He greeted her warmly, his presence a welcome interruption. But as the evening went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sophia knew more than she was letting on. A week later, Thomas confronted me. It was late, and we were both in bed, the room heavy with silence. "Ava," he began cautiously, "is there something you're not telling me?" I froze, my heart hammering. "What do you mean?" He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You've been different lately, distant, and Ethan, I don't know, something feels off." I forced a laugh, shaking my head. "You're imagining things. I've just been tired." But his gaze lingered, and I knew he wasn't convinced. The breaking point came when Jake approached Ethan in the driveway. I watched from the kitchen window, my stomach sinking as their voices grew louder. "You think I don't know what's going on?" Jake said, his tone sharp. Ethan stepped closer, his fists clenched. "Stay out of it, Jake." Jake laughed coldly. "Oh, I don't think so. Secrets like these are dangerous. People get hurt when they come out." Ethan shoved him back. "Don't you dare say anything." But Jake's smirk only widened. "That depends. What's it worth to you?" That night, Ethan came to me, looking pale and shaken. "We have a problem," he said, his voice tight. I listened as he told me about his conversation with Jake, and my panic grew with every word. "What does he want?" I asked, my heart pounding. He didn't say, but he's not going to stay quiet. He won't keep this to himself. I paced the room, my mind racing. "We have to do something. If Thomas finds out—" Ethan grabbed my arm, stopping me. "We'll figure it out together." His words were meant to reassure me, but the knot in my stomach only tightened. The next evening, Thomas invited Jake to dinner, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. "Ava, make sure there's enough wine," Thomas called as I set the table. Jake arrived with his usual charm, but his eyes gleamed with something darker. "Thanks for having me," he said, shaking Thomas's hand. "It's always nice to catch up." Throughout dinner, I felt Jake's eyes on me, his smirk taunting. He asked pointed questions, his words laced with double meanings that made my skin crawl. "So, Ava, how do you manage everything, the house, Ethan, and Thomas? You must have your hands full," he said. I forced a smile, gripping my fork tightly. "It's a balancing act, but I manage." Thomas chuckled. "She's incredible. Keeps everything running smoothly." Jake's smirk widened. "I'll bet." The tension in the air was unbearable, and by the time dinner ended, I was desperate to escape. Later that night, Jake cornered me in the hallway as I carried a stack of plates to the kitchen. "You should be more careful," he said, his voice low. I glared at him. "What do you want, Jake?" He leaned in, his smile predatory. "For now, just to watch you squirm. But don't worry, I'll let you know when I'm ready to collect." The next day, as I was folding laundry in the bedroom, Thomas walked in, his face pale and his hands trembling. "Ava," he began, barely above a whisper, "what is this?" He held out a small bracelet, one I immediately recognized. It was mine, but I had left it in Ethan's room during one of our encounters. My mind raced, but I couldn't find an explanation. The silence between us grew, and then Thomas broke it. "Is this what I think it is?" Tears filled my eyes, but I couldn't bring myself to lie. That evening, Thomas confronted Ethan. The shouting match was deafening, and I froze at the top of the stairs, listening as their words cut through the air like knives. "You betrayed me," Thomas shouted, "in my own house." Ethan didn't back down. Maybe if you'd been paying attention, you would have seen this coming. The sound of a fist hitting the wall made me flinch, and I rushed downstairs, placing myself between them. "Stop," I pleaded, tears streaming down my face. "Please, just stop." But it was too late. The damage was done. The family was shattered, and there was no going back. As the dust settled, Jake made his move. He approached Thomas, feigning concern. "I didn't want to say anything, but I've noticed some things lately. Thought you should know," he said. Thomas's face darkened as Jake shared his version of events, painting Ethan and me as conspirators who had deceived him at every turn. By the time Jake finished, Thomas's trust in both Ethan and me was shattered beyond repair. Ethan left that night, his belongings hastily packed into a duffel bag. He didn't say much, just a quiet, "I'm sorry," before walking out the door. I stood on the porch, watching his taillights disappear down the street, my heart breaking in ways I couldn't describe. Inside, Thomas sat at the kitchen table, staring at the bracelet in his hand. He didn't look up as I walked in, and the silence between us was louder than any argument. In the weeks that followed, the house became a shell of what it had been. Thomas and I barely spoke, and the emptiness left by Ethan's absence was suffocating. Sophia stopped by once, her expression a mixture of pity and disappointment. "You don't have to tell me," she said softly, "but if you ever want to talk, I'm here." I nodded, but deep down I knew there was nothing.